Hi, my name is Rodney Ewing. You're here in my studio at the Pacific Felt Factory. And this is one of my recent works done in 2019 at a residency that I was in at EMS, which is in Omaha, Nebraska. This is called Butterfly Effect. With this piece, I started researching these news articles about this electronic waste site that exists outside of Accra, Ghana. I was really interested in what was going on there. I don't know if you can even call it recycling, because the way it's done is done in such a hazardous way. Just sort of interested in how a small percentage of that electronic waste that ends up there is coming from Europe and other parts of the West. And it really had me start thinking about the history of the West and the relationship it's always had with the continent of Africa, where it's taken its peoples and resources without permission. And now this sort of like this 21st century cyclical event is happening where all that waste is sort of coming back to there. And so I had to think about how I really wanted to represent that. And I found an image of one of the workers from that site, and I incorporated a side view of a slave ship. I had to think about how do I portray like electronic waste, and without getting into the minutiae of details of like drawing motherboards and computers and wires and things like that without looking too chaotic. So I realized that everything electronic that we purchase or we see in stores comes in a rectangular or square box. So I just used the rectangles and square boxes that you see here to represent that waste as it's moving from one shore to the other shore. Looking at a piece from a series I did in 2016 called Fact and Fiction. And the idea of fact and fiction came about with, again, I'm really interested in history as it relates to African and African-American diaspora, and in those stories and those narratives that sort of get lost between the cracks. And I noticed how, as consumers of fiction, we hold those characters and those stories dear to our hearts. It's almost generational, like we pass these stories on. But the stories that happen to actual individuals, especially individuals of color, have a sad tendency to be lost and forgotten into the cracks of history. So I wanted to find a method where I could take those fiction-based literature and use it with the portraits of the actual individuals as a way to sort of retell their story and sort of to bring a more nuanced detail to their lives. So it involved me researching individuals who I felt like their stories had not been told adequately enough, and that were still, in a lot of ways, still relevant to what's going on. This particular piece, this is the image of Henrietta Lacks, who had the mortal cell. She was a cancer patient, and when she died, basically the doctors discovered she had this immortal cell, and a lot of cancer treatments that have been derived even today were based on her cells, but it was done so without her permission or the permission of her family. So with this piece, calling that out and using a quote from Milton's Paradise Lost, which was also in one of the early editions of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, was also the prologue, and it reads, "Did I request thee, maker, from the clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from the darkness to promote me?" That could really be applied to what happened to Henrietta. She didn't give permission to her cells to be exploited. This is part of a series called Broken Shadows, and Broken Shadows came about specifically kind of as a response to the pandemic, and it had several meanings for me. First of all, it was a way to sort of organize myself again. You know, I'm lucky enough that this studio is about a 2-minute walk from where I live. It's in the same complex, so I was able to take advantage of sheltering in place in the space to be able to do my work. Also, it gave me a chance to do this project. I wanted to use this type of paper. They're old ledger papers from doctor's manuals and insurance offices, and I wanted to take the chance to be able to make my own paper, build it to the size and the structures that I wanted, and then also take advantage of the large archive of silkscreen frames that I built up over the last 10 years. All these silkscreens that I have that were for specific projects. I gave myself the project of creating a new piece every day and a half, and also utilizing old silkscreen frames that I had, older images, and see if I could put them together 2, 3, or maybe sometimes even 4 different images together to create a composition and see if I could still talk about these things, about loss, about memory, about the African American diaspora, and create new compositions. So this is one of the pieces that are here, which features this eugenics model from this 17th century doctor, if you can call him that, priestess camper, who felt like African American features were on the low scale of being desirable. In the background is the Jim Crow era prisoners who were forced to do pretty much just slave labor for large agricultural companies and farms. And then last but not least, there's this piece of text here that says, "Home the Brave." So this is from an exhibit that was in 2016 called Untethered, Stories from the Film War. And this project started out with a Sika nomination that I received to be able to apply to this local competition. And it was the year that SF MoMA was under construction, so there wasn't going to be the final show for Sika wasn't going to be in that space. So they had the idea of having spaces in different neighborhoods. So I submitted a proposal about Fillmore and about the history of displacement that took place in that neighborhood. For those of you who don't know, there was a Japanese residence for a long period of time until World War II, where all those residents were placed in internment camps here in the United States. Then African Americans moved into the neighborhood, and they held that spot for probably another 40 years until they were displaced due to urban renewal. And I just felt like those two stories of displacement had rarely intersect. Those stories are hardly ever told together. So I wanted to create a body of work where those stories were actually told together. So I did a number of works on paper. I had just finished a lot of research, and just before I started getting to actually creating the work, I had about a 2-week break, and I knew I wanted to create an object that both cultures would have had in common. And I thought about the house and what specifically about the house, what they've had in common or could be used. And I thought about the windows because they're just so heavily symbolic of home and of place. And also I could take advantage of telling the story simultaneously. So all the windows are two-sided, and so they're all telling the stories of Japanese internment, also telling the stories of African American displacement from the same neighborhood. This is a show that I had at Nancy Toomey, and it was also a project that I collaborated with another artist, Monica Lundy, for this project. So we both did separate bodies of work. We did a lot of research together, and then went our separate medias to create individual pieces around this idea. Today we're looking at a part of an exhibit, or part of a project actually, called Rituals of Water. The basic premise for the project was my reaction to Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 and watching Black and brown bodies being displaced again by the element of water. And it made me start thinking historically about transatlantic slavery, bodies traveling across that body of water, baptism, definitely water cannons being used against civil rights protesters during the civil rights movement. A couple of these deal with the situation that is going on in Flint, Michigan, where it's a mostly poor and Black neighborhood that is affecting, and the water's undrinkable. So I did a series of paintings based on those incidents, and then I created these mason jars which have a little bit of water in them that are condensating to sort of mimic tears and time. And each one of them has a different image. These are specifically from Flint. You can see where this one has found an image of the corroded pipes from Flint, Michigan. This one is two-sided, and it shows a mother having to bathe her child with bottled water. And then on the side is an image of baptism. And the same thing with this one. This image is actually originally supposed to be horizontal, but I thought it was beautiful in its own way, being vertical. The work you're looking at here is a part of a project that started at the Headlands in 2019 called The Devil Finds Work. The premise for this project is to explore how the Black body has had to find ways to navigate physical, social, and psychological spaces in and around the United States of America. It started out with a set of children's blocks that highlighted the differences the lessons that Black children have to learn versus their white counterparts. Now it's extended to a body of work called game theory. As you can see, there are a set of large dice. One set of dice has the word Black on all 6 sides. The other die has different words such as identity, suspicion, living, waiting, sitting, all things that have made headlines in recent years, with African Americans basically just doing mundane things that a lot of people would take for granted, but they attract attention of law enforcement. And the letters are raised. I'm actually going to be able to ink these up and use them as a printmaking matrix and actually roll these to make a much larger piece on paper. And game theory is about just the precarious nature of living Black in America right now. And it is, and every day it is, as we've seen in the news with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, again, doing mundane things like jogging, sleeping, leaving a store. These events end up in tragedy. So this piece is to highlight that game of chance that I had to unwillingly participate in.